And so now we get to chapter 29. And so remember, Saul is preparing for battle against the Philistines. The Philistines have how many kings? This was pretty standard during the reign of the Philistines and that reign. There was never really one big king over the Philistines. There was always, what? 5 kings, okay? And so David is most familiar with the king of what? Which Philistine city? Rhymes with Bath. Gath, right? The king of Gath, which is ironic because who else was from Gath? Goliath, right? But David's been in the city of Gath for quite some time. In fact, he's been raiding against the foreign people around that area. He goes back and he tells the king of Gath that he's been raiding against who? The Israelites, right? What, was David lying? Yes, he was lying. Okay? But the king of Gath thinks, well, if he's been fighting against the Israelites hate him. And now we're going to battle against Saul and the Israelites. So who does Gath think that he's going to bring into his army? David and his 600 warriors, who were a pretty formidable foe. I mean, they've been fighting for quite some time now. In fact, the king of Gath thinks so much of David, he actually makes him a lord and gives him his own city. I mean, he's the first person to give David some status. So here we have in chapter 29, where the king calls forth David, and he tells David, he says, you know what, you're going to be my warrior. You're going to come fight with me. And David comes up with the king of Gath, and he comes up with the other the Philistine kings, and verses 1 through 5 say, What are you doing? That's David. He's like, I know, but David's cool, right? I mean, I know he wasn't always cool, but he's pretty cool now. He's been fighting with me, and he's been making raids against the Israelites and fighting against them and killing all the people, and he's one of us now. And the rest of the Philistine kings, what do they say in verses 1 through 5? They say, no, you big dummy. Like, he's the next door to king of Israel. Gath's like, no, he's one of our guys now. They're like, no, you can tell David to go home because we're not fighting with David, because you're going to put David in the back and David's going to start attacking us from the back, and we're not going to have that. So the Philistine kings tell David to go back home. Good move or bad move? I'd say it's probably a pretty good move, wouldn't you? I mean, David hasn't been attacking the Israelites. One commentary says that David was asked to fight against his own people. Luckily, perhaps the providence of God, he didn't have to do that. But it says, David's 16 months in Ziklag probably marked a low point in his spiritual walk with God. He displayed a lack of faith in going there, as though God could not protect him in his own land. He was not honest with the king after he arrived there, and it was only because of God's intervening grace that he was spared from having to fight his own people. Significantly, too, it was during this time that his men nearly mutinied against him, not being sure that he was leading them aright. Had he been doing so well until this time, but here he definitely slipped. And what he's talking about here is at the end of chapter 29, we see in verses 6 through 11 that David is dismissed. And here I have a little Lego picture for you in case you like Legos. I thought it was cute. That dude's supposed to be a Philistine king saying, why are the Hebrews here? Why doesn't he say Israelites? Why does he say Hebrews? In the Old Testament, generally, when outsiders are talking about the Israelites, they always use Hebrews. Not always, but most of the time they use Hebrews and not Israelites. Okay, so here we have a map that you see here. The green is Saul bringing his forces from his capital up to Endor. And so here you have the maroon lines are the ones where the Philistine kings, the 5 Philistine kings, are gathering their forces at Apec. Anybody remember Apec? What happened at Apec? We're going way back, several weeks. Something happened there. Something pretty big. When you have tests in school and they check the scores and the teachers, like the kids don't answer the right way, is that a reflection on the teacher? Well, no. What's that? No, that's not what the priests were killed, but same theme, okay? There were some pretty important people killed, including a prophet. and his sons. Because there was a battle at Apec against the Philistines, and the sons of Eli took the ark that was there in the tabernacle to the battle. They lost. They captured the ark. And when Eli was told about the ark being captured, what did he do? Fell over and he died, right? So they're gathering their forces at Apec, and they're going to go attack Saul and the Israelites at Endor. They tell David to go back home. So David doesn't get to fight 40 miles north in Endor against the Israelites. He goes back to Ziklag. But when he goes back to his hometown, well, not his hometown, but where he's staying at, in chapter 30, we see that his city is attacked. Let's look at verses 8 through 9 of chapter 30. Verses 8 through 9. As David is going back to Ziklag, he's coming there and he realizes that while all the men have been left to go fight, that the Ammonites come in there, or Amalekites, and they sack the town. They take the food, they take the money, they take the women, and they're fleeing. So now they get back to the city and all the men's stuff is gone, including their wives. And so they're really upset. Let's look at verse 8. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered them, pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and you shall surely rescue. So David sent out he and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook of Besor, where those who were left stayed behind. Okay, David gets back and his wives are gone. Men, think about how that would make you feel. You get back and you find out that other men have come into your town, they've taken your stuff, they've taken your wives. Pretty upsetting? Pretty upsetting, right? What's the first thing David does when he faces adversity? Where does he turn? Where did Saul turn? To the witch at Endor. All right, you see the dichotomy there? Right word, dichotomy? Okay. All right, you see the dichotomy there between Saul turning towards the witch in Endor and David turning towards God? Now we have to ask ourselves, when we face adversity in our lives, where do we turn? Do we turn to our own strength? Do we turn to our own intelligence? Do we turn to our emotions? That's what most people do, right? We turn towards our emotions, and we're a slave to our emotions. But David turned first to God. All right? So God says, no, David, go attack them. You're going to win. Just go attack. Let's look at verses 16 through 20. And when he had taken him down, behold, there was a spread abroad over the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped except for 400 young men, who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, this is David's spoil. So David goes and he attacks these people, and it's a resounding victory. He gets there, they're drinking, they're celebrating, and while they're celebrating this vast not land grab, but all these possessions, why do they feel safe enough to do this, to let their guard down? It seems so stupid, but why do you think they did that? Do they think anybody's going to come after them? Yes or no? It's one or the other. No. Why? They attacked 2 different nations, right? Who are the 2 nations? The Philistines and the who? And the Judeans, right? Where are they? We're talking about Ziklag down here, okay? All right? All the Philistines have gone up north to fight the Israelites. Where are the Israelites? They're all up north fighting the Judeans. Fighting the Philistines. So they're like, let's just go take their stuff. Nobody's at home. Imagine this. Imagine if the United States was in an all-out war with Canada, okay? And we're afraid we're going to lose. I realize this is a bad illustration, okay? They'd probably say sorry and give us some Canadian bacon, right, Erin? Or is she in here? No? Okay, good. She's probably upset at that one. Okay. Anyways, Canadian bacon with, what's that dude's name? The big guy? You know what I'm talking about. He was in Cool Runnings. John Kane? Candy? It's an interesting movie, okay? I'm sorry, but no, I digress, okay? All right. So if all of our forces, all of our men are out of Texas, why wouldn't Mexico go to Texas and just take whatever they wanted? Nobody's at home. And that's basically what happens here. These guys go in the southern region, the Philistine and the Israelite, they take all the stuff and they're partying because nobody's coming. They're all 40 miles north fighting each other. But they don't realize that David has been kicked out of the Philistine army. And David comes home early and realizes that, wait a minute, they've taken my stuff. And so David hunts them down, and while they're dancing and drinking, he comes and takes care of business. And so that's why he's able to surprise attack them with a much smaller force and get all of his stuff back. And so David's pursuit and intel, he gets his intel from an Amalekite guy. David's bounty, we see he gets all this stuff, he's bringing it back, but there's a problem. Okay, if you remember, in the earlier chapter, we're in chapter 31, I'm getting ahead of myself. David takes 400 of his 600 men with him to fight. He leaves 200 men back to take care of the stuff. All right, they get back from the battle, and the guys that have fought in the battle, they don't want to split their stuff up with the 200 guys that were back with the stuff. And they said, look, man, we were out there fighting with swords against men. You guys were sitting here with the donkeys, the camels, and the bread. You ain't getting anything. And so the 200 guys were like, well, we deserve our stuff too. And so it goes to David. And David is the one who has to decide what's going to take place. What does David decide to do? I realize unless you read ahead, you don't realize this. But what do you think David does? He splits it with all of them, right? He says, if God has blessed us, He's blessed all of us. Which I think is an interesting thing that he says here. He says out of God's blessings, all of His people should benefit from those blessings. We share our blessings with each other. As Christians, should it not be the same with ourselves? If you look at the New Testament verses like Hebrews 13:16 and Romans 12:13 and 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 14 through 26, Galatians 6:10, all pretty much say the same thing. God has blessed us, He's blessed all of us. Right? We should be concerned about other people. Well, if they don't have as much, that's just their fault. Right? Now, I realize that we have to take care of our own needs. Galatians 6 talks about that, but it also talks in the very same section about how we have an obligation to each other to make sure the needs of each other are being taken care of. And so, as a Christian, are you responsible for your soul? Yes. Are you responsible for every other soul in this room here tonight? Yes. You have a responsibility. You will stand alone before God on the day of judgment. You'll have to answer for your own sins. But you will also have to answer if you did not help other people in the midst of their struggles. Does that make sense? I feel like I may not be making that clear. We have an obligation to each other to build each other up. Right? Hebrews 10:24 and 25. God expects us to be a family. He set up the church so we would have a spiritual family to help each other out and to bless each other. And that's what David decided to do here in chapter 31. Chapter 30. As we move on to chapter 31, we see that the battle ensues. Let's go ahead and take some time and read verses 1 through 13 of chapter 31. And this is the last chapter of 1 Samuel. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest the uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his own sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all of his men on the same day together. And when the men of Israel who were with him on the other side of the valley, those beyond the Jordan, saw the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul, his 3 sons, fallen on Mount Gilboa, and they cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. And they put his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall at Bethshan, where the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard the Philistines had done to Saul. And all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and came to Jabesh and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. So here we have the end of 1 Samuel with the death of Saul. And so just as Samuel had told Saul the night before, it had come true. He had been killed, his sons had been killed, and any remnant, I guess, of Saul's glory was pretty much officially over. The armor bearer refused to kill Saul, which is interesting because who else refused to kill Saul? David. What was David before he fled away? He was what? He was a friend of Jonathan, but he had a role. He had a job. Anybody remember what David's job was? He played music. That's right. I'm thinking more of a military job. He was an armor bearer. Right? Interesting here that the armor bearer refused to kill Saul, and his previous armor bearer, which would have been David, also refused multiple times, at least twice, to kill Saul. Here David says multiple times, not here in this passage, but here in our text, that he could not kill the Lord's anointed. And even with death a certainty, even the armor bearer still couldn't kill the Lord's anointed, which makes it interesting that there was some sort of unwritten rule that you couldn't kill whom God had made king. And so, how did they treat the body of Saul?
Like a trophy.
Like a trophy? Okay. In contempt. Even in the ancient world, when somebody of notable stature, when you came across their body, they were supposed to be treated with respect, right? Technically, it was like that in many that's a pretty standard thing, right? I mean, you can look at instances in the Civil War, even World War II. People get different treatment based upon their rank, right? If they're a high-up officer, they're supposed to have certain things, right? That was not always the case if you didn't like that person or if you treated that person with contempt. I'm thinking about Hitler, right? Hitler wanted his body to be burned because he didn't want the Russians, right? He hated the Russians. He thought if the Russians got there and found his body, they would desecrate his body some sort of way, right? Saul says to the armor bearer, "Kill me." Why does he want to be killed? Right, he didn't want to be killed by the uncircumcised. He didn't want to be mistreated, right? He didn't want to be tortured in front of people for their entertainment. And so when they find the body of Saul, do they treat it with respect or with contempt? Contempt, right? They cut his head off. They fasten his head and his body to a wall for people to see it as they pass by with his sons. And so what is the reaction by the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead? What's their response to this action of Saul and his sons? They go rescue, right? Or at least take it back, right? And they burn the bones and the head, and they bury the ashes and what's kind of left of it. So they'll kind of leave them alone. And they're going to be rewarded for that later on in 2 Samuel by David for their bravery. Are there any questions as we close out 1 Samuel? The book of 1 Samuel. No questions? Don't be shy. The lines are open. Okay. All right. So now we're going to be moving into 2 Samuel. And before we get into 2 Samuel, as we kind of close the chapter on Saul's life, behind me you kind of see an arc of Saul's life. You see that he started out well, young and handsome and good looking, and he rose. I mean, he was God's anointed. He was chosen to be the first king of God's people, and yet it just derailed from there. I mean, there were several times in his life where he probably could have gotten right, but he just was too arrogant. He was too hard-headed. He just had to do things his way and not God's way. And because of that, not only did he suffer, but also his sons. When we choose to make poor decisions in our life, are we the only people who pay the consequences for that? No. You never are in a vacuum. right? When you decide to make poor choices, when you decide to rebel against God, when you decide that you don't care what anybody else thinks or how they feel, you're going to do things your way, you hurt other people every time. Whether those are your family, your friends, your church family, your actions have consequences not only for yourself, but also for other people. And sometimes we need to take a step back and realize that not only am I hurting myself, I'm hurting those around me. And sometimes those around us hurt worse than we actually do ourselves if we never really realize what's going on. Okay, so now we have 2 Samuel chapter 1. Still no questions? Okay. All right. Well, now let's get into 2 Samuel. As you can see on the board behind me, you have kind of a lineage of the people who lived. Now, we have to remember that this chapter is closely linked with chapter 31, almost no break in the action. Why is that the case? Why is there no real pause between 31 and chapter 1? It's one book, right? The reason why it's two books today is because the Greeks had to cut it in half because it was too big to fit on one scroll. So they had to cut it in half. It was just one book. And so when you read chapter 31 and go into chapter 1, there's no break in the action. I mean, verse 1 picks right up with the last verse of chapter 31 because there is no break in the action. It's just one book. And in fact, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles was all one book. So let's go on to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. All right? In verses 1 through 10, David is informed about what takes place. In that passage, an Amalekite comes and he tells David that he is the one who's killed Saul. Why would he have done that? Why would an Amalekite who was fighting for the Israelites come and tell David that he was the one who killed Saul? Yeah, thought it might be a reward, right? Thought he might get some payback. Why is that interesting? Has this happened before? No. But it will happen again. Just remember this incident because in about 3 chapters, we're going to see something extremely similar. So the Amalekite, who was a mercenary for the Israelites, comes to David and says, "You're going to be the next king of Israel, and I've taken care of your adversary." And what does David do to this individual? Let's look at verses 11 through 16 of chapter 1. 11 through 16, and let's see David's reaction. David took a hold of his clothes and he tore them. And so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and they wept and fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." And David said to him, "How is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." So how did David take this news of Saul's death? Did he rejoice? No. Was he happy? But his way had been cleared. I mean, David's been on the run for years at this point. I mean, years. He's been in exile in his own land. He hasn't been able to be around his own family, his own father and mother. He had to leave them in Edom. And he finds out Saul's been killed and he mourns, right? Some may say, well, he wasn't probably really upset about Saul being killed. It was probably more just his best friend Jonathan. Which might be the case if we don't read verses 17 through 27. Let's read verses 17 through 27 to see how David felt about Saul, the man who worked so hard to get him killed. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah, and behold, it was written in the book of Jasher. He said, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, from the bow of Jonathan turn not back, and the sword of Saul remained not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, and they were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold in your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of a woman. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So David was not concerned about relishing in Saul's death. He was more concerned about making a lamentation. What is a lamentation? Yeah, mourning, right? It's a mourning, right? To lament is to cry, literally. And so if you have a lamentation, you have a poetry or a song that's really sad, right? It's like listening to country music, right? My grandmother wouldn't listen to country music because she said it was too sad. I'm moving on. There's something Brittany's dad always says, but it's probably not appropriate for it. No, it's not. Okay, moving on. All right. He doesn't care for country music either. All right. He says it's too sad. All right. It's kind of what lamentation is, right? It's a sad song. And so David has this song made, and he spreads it throughout Judea, and he tells the people to recite it. And he talks about the glory of Saul and all that Saul has done for the people of Israel. And so David isn't excited about that. One interesting verse that we'll mention real quick before we end class, because I know our time is short. Verse 26. All right? In this passage, he says, your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of a woman. This word is used by homosexual Christians, and I use that term loosely, to say that David and Jonathan had a homosexual relationship. And since David and Jonathan had a homosexual relationship, and David was a man after God's own heart, that you can be a practicing homosexual and a faithful Christian. I would disagree vehemently that this passage means anything in that nature. The exact same Hebrew word is translated love throughout the Old Testament. It's also translated as friendship, such as in Psalm 109, 4 and 5. And so to argue this has some sort of sexual connotation based upon the word being here love is not biblically accurate. I'm just going to be honest with you. Love in the ancient world was not the way we think of love. The husband-wife relationship was not the way we think of husband-wife relationship. Most of you married your spouse because you loved your spouse, right? You may not love them now, right? But you married them because you loved them, right? In the ancient world, you had a spouse because she was given to you or you bought her. And the main reason that you got married was not because you loved her and not because she was pretty and not because she was a good cook, but it's because she had wide hips and can give you sons. And you didn't share the same tent, and you didn't eat together, and you didn't go on trips together, and you didn't, tell her how pretty she was in dresses like that. That was not the purpose of marriage. There was little to no emotional connection in the ancient world. And it's only been different for a couple of 100 years. This just not was the case. And so here, David probably didn't have very strong emotional connections to his spouses. They were seen as vessels to birth sons. Crudely, okay? I'm not saying that's the right way to look at things. I'm just telling you how it was. But David had a friendship with Jonathan, right? He would talk to Jonathan about politics. He would talk to him about his hardships. He would talk to him about the things that was going on. He had an emotional friendship with Jonathan, something that most married couples in the ancient world just didn't have. So he's talking about a friendship here and not sexual love. That's important because this is one of the number one passages used by a growing movement in the church. There are several churches of the Lord's congregation who identify as the Lord's congregation who say that it is completely okay to be a practicing homosexual. This is one of the passages they use, so be familiar with it. Realize the Hebrew word is also translated friendship in Psalm 109, verse 4 and 5. Any questions before we end class? Anything? No?
Isaac, what does it say in verse 18? Also he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow.
Well, the song was called The Bow.
Okay.
And it was called The Bow because of Jonathan's bow. Sometimes the wording in some translations is a little difficult, but the song is The Bow. And so when it says he made them learn the bow, that's the title of the song. Great question. Great question. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate somebody saying something in class today. Mercy. No, I apologize. I need to garner more discussion. I'll try better next week. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this day and thank you for all the many blessings you've given us. Thank you so much for all that we have. We're so thankful for your word that teaches us how we all are to live. And Heavenly Father, please help us to learn from these men, from their failures, from their successes, about how we can better equip ourselves to be faithful in the midst of hardships, in the midst of struggles. Please watch over us as a congregation of the Lord's Church here at Chapel Hill. Help us to be faithful individually, but also to be concerned about each other, about our struggles, about our triumphs. And please help us to be faithful ultimately to you. Please watch over us and bless us. We're so thankful for your Son. In His name we pray. Amen.